So tonight, thank you for joining us for Book by Book, and we are going to be walking through chapters 16, 17, and 18 of 2 Kings. And so we're finally going to get to the end of the Northern Kingdoms. They will be done after tonight's passages, and then we'll just focus in on Judah, the Southern Kingdom. And so as we are walking through these, there's different elements of these passages that are, as I was even reading through, preparing for this, just really sad. When we think about the promises of God to Abraham and the fact that the people of Israel were so rebellious for so long, but the Lord was so faithful even when they were rebellious, and he sustained them all this time. But that it got to the point where the Lord said, no more. And so we should read these passages with some grief, even though it happened, thousands of years ago. It is still, it should remind us of our own frailty and our own moments of weakness and unfaithfulness, and in those times to call out to the Lord to say, oh, there is a way. You don't have to keep going down the path of destruction. You can turn and trust the Lord. And so today we're going to start with with Ahaz in Judah, and he is terrible. And then we're going to see the last king of Israel. And chapter 17 really is about the end of Israel, but then we're going to be introduced to Hezekiah, who is a good king. And of all of the kings in Judah, he's the only one who says, the writer says, was like David. There were other kings who did good things, but Hezekiah is really the first good king like David ever, even in the Southern Kingdom. And so, which is kind of hard to get our brain around, because we've had some good kings, but Hezekiah was the first to do some very important reforms as we walk through this. So chapter 16, verse 1 starts with this. In the 17th year of Pekah, son of Remaliah, son of Remaliah, Ahaz, son of Jotham, king of Judah, began to reign. Ahaz was 20 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 16 years. Unlike David, his father, he did not do what was right in the eyes of the Lord, his God. He followed the ways of the kings of Israel and even sacrificed his son in the fire, engaging in the detestable practices of the nations the Lord had driven out before the Israelites. He offered sacrifices and burnt incense at the high places, on the hilltops, and under every spreading tree. And so here we are given right away a picture of just how awful Ahaz was. And he is not like David, and he is actively engaging in idolatrous practices. And the worst of them here is this offering of his sons in the fire. Now, whether or not this was a human sacrifice is debatable. People are not totally sure what this is, but the cult around Molech involved child sacrifice as a way of trying to earn Molech's favor and protection. And so Molech was one of the Canaanite gods that the Lord wanted the people to remove from the land as part of the conquest of Joshua. But they never drove all of the Canaanites out. And so Molech practices were around. And so Ahaz did this. And why he did this is not really explained here, but it was most likely kind of an act of desperation to try to protect Jerusalem. Because while Ahaz is coming into his reign, and while all of his kingdom is, he's trying to hold things together, Assyria is continuing to grow in power, and Assyria is attacking the northern kingdom and chipping away at the boundaries of Israel. And so there are threats to Ahaz that he, was not trusting the Lord, and so he looks to the other gods. And so he offered his son in the fire. So not not necessarily his firstborn, but a son, maybe. And also he was going to the high places and burning incense there. Now we remember the other kings did not eliminate the high places, but it doesn't say that they were going there. But here Ahaz is all in with the idolatry of the northern kingdoms. And so he's a bad dude. He's not a good king. Then Rezin, king of Aram, and Pekah, son of Remaliah, king of Israel, marched up to fight against Jerusalem and besieged Ahaz, but they could not overpower him. At that time, Rezin, king of Aram, recovered Elath for Aram by driving out the people of Judah. Edomites then moved into Elath and have lived there to this day. Ahaz sent messengers to Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria. I am your servant and vassal. Come up and save me out of the hand of the king of Aram and of the king of Israel, who are attacking me. And Ahaz took the silver and gold found in the temple of the Lord and in the treasuries of the royal palace and sent it as a gift to the king of Assyria. The king of Assyria complied by attacking Damascus and capturing it. He deported its inhabitants to Kir and put Rezin to death. And so now Ahaz, he has the Syrians, the Aram, and Israel coming against him. And so he reaches out to Assyria to say, hey, come help me. I will submit myself to you. And so he is going to a foreign king instead of trusting the Lord, which is not good. And so he is giving money and all of these things to try to buy loyalty from the king of Assyria. And so Assyria comes and helps and actually attacks Damascus, which distracts Rezin. So Rezin then has to go back to his home country to fight and defend his homeland. And so that steers away the attack from Israel and Syria or Aram. And so then that works for him and buys him some time. Verse 10, then King Ahaz went to Damascus to meet Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria. He saw an altar in Damascus and sent to Uriah the priest a sketch of the altar with detailed plans for its construction. So Uriah the priest built an altar in accordance with all the plans that King Ahaz had sent from Damascus and finished it before King Ahaz returned. When the king came back from Damascus and saw the altar, he approached it and presented offerings on it. He offered up his burnt offerings and grain offering, poured out his drink offering, and splashed the blood of his fellowship offerings against the altar. As for the bronze altar that stood before the Lord, he brought it from the front of the temple, from between the new altar and the temple of the Lord, and put it on the north side of the new altar. King Ahaz then gave these orders to Uriah the priest. On the large new altar, offer the morning burnt offerings and the evening grain offering, the king's burnt offering and his grain offering, and the burnt offering of all the people of the land, and their grain offering and their drink offering. Splash against this altar the blood of all the burnt offerings and sacrifices, but I will use the bronze altar for seeking guidance. And Uriah the priest did just as King Ahaz had ordered. And so he goes up to Damascus because the Tiglath-Pileser, the Assyrians, they conquered Damascus. And now Judah, the nation of Judah, is now a vassal state to the Assyrians because the stronger party now has dominance over them. And so he goes up there to check in with his new overlord, essentially. And so while he's up there, he's impressed by this altar at the temple in Damascus. And when we first read through this, like, it should set up some red flags here, because the Lord gave specific instructions for the altar in the tabernacle. And then Solomon took the instructions for the tabernacle and kind of just blew it up when he built the temple. But the specific instructions for the temple altar, the Lord didn't give specific instructions for all of that. Solomon was just kind of continuing to go along. And so we don't necessarily have this this prohibition for changing any of the elements of the altar. You could update it, you could change it. We don't have a strict don't do this. But the fact that he saw this pagan temple and was impressed with it and wanted to bring it back into the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem, that's the red flag here, is you are looking at the nations and trying to be like the nations. And so that's part of Ahaz's issue. But then also the way he is talks about the altar and is like, do all of the stuff that we will normally do in the temple, do all of that on the new altar. But I'm going to use the older altar that's made of bronze to seek guidance, which is actually not what the altar was for. Like, the altar was for burning the sacrifices. It was not supposed to be something that was a kind of like a way to get like visions or like divination. Like, that's what pagan altars would use for. They would like cut out animal entrails and stuff and try to discern the future from animal guts, which I don't really know. I mean, that tells you a lot about the past, like what this animal ate. I don't really know how they made the leap to say this is how this waste tells us about the future, but whatever. But so that's another level of corruption where he's taking the things of God and using them in a way that is not as God designed. And so, yeah, so King Ahaz is not a good dude. And so in verse 17, King Ahaz cut off the side panels and removed the basins from the movable stands. He removed the sea from the bronze bowls that supported it and set it on a stone base. He took away the Sabbath canopy that had been built at the temple and removed the royal entryway outside the temple of the Lord in deference to the king of Assyria. As for the other events of the reign of Ahaz and what he did, are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Judah? Ahaz rested with his ancestors and was buried with them in the city of David. And Hezekiah, his son, succeeded him as king. Now, as we see him cutting off the side panels and removing these bowls, like the wash basin that Solomon constructed was really large, and it was used for like cleansing people and offerings and stuff, but it had these bowls of bronze underneath, and so 3 bowls facing each direction, and so north, south, east, and west, and so there were these 12 bowls, 12 like representing the tribes of Israel and all this different stuff. But Ahaz has to remove all of these things to pay off the Assyrians. Like the cost of the Assyrians' protection is now coming into the temple where the most valuable stuff is. And so he's like sending all of that off. And then there's this one note that he removes the Sabbath canopy in deference to the king. I don't really know what the Sabbath canopy is. That's not really listed in the instructions of building the temple. And so it was some kind of like covering, but why the king wanted it removed, why Tiglath-Pileser wanted it removed, we don't know. It might have just been one of those things like Van Halen. They had this writer, which is when you're in a band, it's like, these are the requirements that we have to play this show. And they used to get a lot of people made fun of them because in their rider was 1 bowl of green M&Ms. And people were like, wow, that's so weird. We're like, is it going to make you like sing better? But it was assigned to them. Like if they came into the green room and they saw just a bowl of green M&Ms, it's like, hey, they actually read the rider. And so it's a one way to be able to prepare. Like if they read this, then they probably took care of the sound needs and those kinds of things as well. Like they're paying attention. And so this may have just been one of those things where the king said, I don't want you to have that anymore. And so he just did it because Tiglath-Pileser said so, right? And so Ahaz is awful. He's just awful. But as Assyria is becoming a more and more dominant power, he's just trying to hold on to any kind of security. And when we read in the Psalms, there's a line that says, some trust in chariots, some trust in horses, but we will trust in the Lord our God. And Ahaz is not trusting in the Lord. Like that is like what we are to take away from King Ahaz's life. Did not trust the Lord, sought other gods, sought other kingdoms, and ultimately he weakened the nation of Judah because of that. So let's jump into chapter 17 for the last king of Israel, Hoshea, and starting in verse 1. In the 12th year of Ahaz, king of Judah, Hoshea, son of Elah, became king of Israel in Samaria, and he reigned 9 years. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, but not like the kings of Israel who preceded him. Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, came up to attack Hoshea, who had been Shalmaneser's vassal and had paid him tribute. But the king of Assyria discovered that Hoshea was a traitor, for he had sent envoys to So, king of Egypt, and he no longer paid tribute to the king of Assyria, as he had done year by year. Therefore, Shalmaneser seized him and put him in prison. The king of Assyria invaded the entire land, marched against Samaria, and laid siege to it for 3 years. In the 9th year of Hoshea, king of Assyria, the king of Assyria captured Samaria and deported the Israelites to Assyria. He settled them in Hala, in Gozan, and on the Habor River, and in the towns of the Medes. So Hoshea saw a moment of weakness. So the previous section, we read about Tiglath-Pileser as the king of Assyria, but now here we have Shalmaneser is the king. So there is a transition happening, and Hoshea saw this as an opportunity to get free of the Assyrians because he thought maybe they were weak. So he reaches out to the Egyptians to try to get their support. And so this is the traitor Hoshea trying to make allegiance to a different, stronger empire. But the Assyrians, they rallied and they came and they defeated the northern kingdom and laid siege to the city. And that siege tactic is to make the city weak. And so for 3 years, there's no in or out. There's no real support for agriculture, livestock, all of these things. Now the city is just cut off from the world. And so after 3 years, they probably were not able to do anything. And so that's when the siege finally broke the city, and Shalmaneser comes and takes them and deports them. And this was the practice of the Assyrians when they conquered land, was to go take people from the land and move them someplace else, so that the loyalty to the land and like national identity would be broken. And so this is part of their strategy. They're not the only empires to do this, but the Assyrians, they did this all over the place. And we're going to read this more about that in a moment here. So then the next section talks about why this happened, right? And so as we've been reading through from Deuteronomy to now, we have been given warnings over and over again, like disobedience will lead you to exile. And so that now the writer of 2 Kings is at this point saying like why this all happened. They should not be surprised by this, and we should not be surprised by this because of their rebellion. And so verse 7 says, all this took place because the Israelites had sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them out of Egypt from under the power of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. They worshipped other gods and followed the practices of the nations the Lord had driven out before them, as well as the practices that the kings of Israel had introduced. The Israelites secretly did things against the Lord their God that were not right. From watchtower to fortified city, they built themselves high places in all their towns. They set up sacred stones and Asherah poles on every high hill and under every spreading tree. At every high place they burned incense, as the nations whom the Lord had driven out before them had done. They did wicked things that aroused the Lord's anger. They worshipped idols, though the Lord had said, you shall not do this. The Lord warned Israel and Judah through all his prophets and seers, turn from your evil ways, observe my commands and decrees in accordance with the entire law that I commanded your ancestors to obey, that I delivered to you through my servants, the prophets. And so all of these things, we've read their history, like they did bad, they did awful things. And so it's all part of God's promise to the people. Like, if you do this, this will happen. And so here we are given this note as well. Like the Lord raised up prophets to call people back. Up to this point, the real only prophets we've really been interacting with have been Elijah, Elisha, a little bit of Jonah, and some unnamed prophets that were actually calling people back into right relationship with God. And so when we finish with 2 Kings, we're going to jump into Isaiah and start working through those messages, because this is Yeah, this is where like the prophets they're talking about are Isaiah, Hosea, Amos, those prophets that were working with like the trying to reach out and get the northern kingdom to turn away. And so, yeah, so while we haven't heard them specifically, that's who Second Kings is talking about here. Verse 14, but they would not listen and were as stiff-necked as their ancestors who did not trust in the Lord their God. So those ancestors would be the Israelites who came out of Egypt, right? The great irony of all of this also, before I go too far, is Hoshea was found to be a traitor because he was trying to get Egypt's help. And now the writer is saying like, the Lord brought them out of Egypt, and now he's trying to get Egypt's help, trying to put the kingdom back into a kind of slavery in Egypt. And so this is also part of like why don't you just trust me, that the Lord is wanting them to recognize, just trust the Lord. They rejected his decrees and the covenant he had made with their ancestors and the statutes he had warned them to keep. They followed worthless idols and themselves became worthless. They imitated the nations around them, although the Lord had ordered them, do not do as they do. They forsook all the commands of the Lord their God and made for themselves 2 idols cast in the shape of calves and an Asherah pole. And so those are the 2 at Bethel and at Dan, so north and south, to the 2 golden calves. They bowed down to the starry hosts and they worshiped Baal. They sacrificed their sons and daughters in the fire. They practiced divination and sought omens and sold themselves to do evil in the eyes of the Lord, arousing his anger. So the Lord was very angry with Israel and removed them from his presence. Only the tribe of Judah was left, and even Judah did not keep the commands of the Lord their God. They followed the practices Israel had introduced. Therefore, the Lord rejected all the people of Israel. He afflicted them and gave them into the hands of plunderers until he thrust them from his presence. And so, up to this point, we've seen Judah do some bad things, but now the writer of Second Kings is throwing Judah into this mix as well. Yeah, Israel's bad, but don't get too attached to Judah is basically what we're getting a little foreshadowing here for the future. Verse 21, when he tore Israel away from the house of David, they made Jeroboam, son of Nebat, their king. Jeroboam enticed Israel away from following the Lord and caused them to commit a great sin. The Israelites persisted in all the sins of Jeroboam and did not turn away from them until the Lord removed them from his presence, as he had warned them through all the servants of prophets. So the people of Israel were taken from their homeland into exile in Assyria, and they are still there. So the northern kingdom, the 10 tribes taken into Assyrian territories. And here we're given an indication that this section of Second Kings is written before Judah is taken into exile, or maybe like right when they're taken into exile. We're not entirely sure, but when he says the people of Israel are still in exile to this day, is a note to us, like this is fresh information, like for the people. The writer here does not know all that's about to happen to Judah, maybe. And so, it's somewhere between 722 BC and 586 BC is probably when this was written. But all of these things are happening because of their disobedience to the Lord, and their unwillingness to repent. So they are driven from the Lord's presence. And God's everywhere. So thinking driven from the Lord's presence isn't just it's not just a change of geography. It's more than now you don't live here, so God doesn't know where you went. You didn't give him the forwarding address. It's not like that at all. He's saying this is my land. I love this land, and I choose to let my glory dwell in the temple in Jerusalem at this time. And so removing them from there is like taking them from proximity to the place that he chooses to dwell, even though he is everywhere. Right. And so, to be removed from the presence of God like this should wake people up there seems to be maybe a note of they woke up here, because when it says, and did not turn away from them until the Lord removed them from his presence. And maybe that until is like once that they were finally removed from his presence, they're like, wait a second, we did wrong. Maybe. We don't know for sure. But all of this is part of God's promise in the covenant. If you don't follow these commands, I will remove you, and it is all coming to pass. But I want to make sure that I am covering all of these things. Sorry. Yeah. All right. There was something that I thought, and then it disappeared. So let's pick up in verse 24, because the Assyrians didn't just take people out of the land and put them someplace else. They also brought people from other lands into the land of Israel. And this was all part of their grand plan of breaking up the power structures, the local power structures. And so they didn't take necessarily all of the Israelites out of the land. They took probably the most influential, good percentage of folks. So there were probably some Israelites still there, but they were not going to be enough to kind of overpower the influx of foreign people coming into the land. And so it really did become this melting pot. Yeah, all right, verse 24. The king of Assyria brought people from Babylon, Kutha, Ava, Hamath, Hamath, and where'd it go? And replaced and settled them in the towns of Samaria to replace the Israelites. They took over Samaria and lived in its towns. When they first lived there, they did not worship the Lord, so he sent lions among them, and they killed some of the people. It was reported to the king of Assyria, the people you deported and resettled in the towns of Samaria do not know what the God of that country requires. He has sent lions among them, which are killing them off because the people do not know what he requires. So this is, we see the Lord can use animals for his purposes. When the young guys were making fun of Elisha, Elisha called down these bears and they mauled a bunch of kids, right? Not a great story to tell at Sunday school, I have learned, but still, it's one of those things where like God is sovereign over all these things. And so the people come in and they're just bringing in whatever pagan practices they had, and they're worshiping in God's land, right? In the land of Israel. And so he's like, I'm not having this. And so he sends these lions to start attacking the people. So they we don't know how to work. They don't know how to worship the God of this land, because remember, the people in the ancient world were very tied to geography. And so there was a sense that like the God of the land is also very tied to the land and limited to the land. And so you need to know what's going on in the land. And so like there's a story where a kingdom is attacking the northern kingdom, and they attack on the hills and they lose, and like, oh, this is the God of the hills. Maybe we should fight in the valley. There's a different God down there. And so they fight in the valley, and God still defeats their enemies. This is during Elisha's ministry. And so they're like, well, we'll figure out what to do here. So the king of Assyria gave this order: have one of the priests you took captive from Samaria go back to live there and teach the people what the God of the land requires. One priest, have one priest go back and teach all these people what to do. And remember, the priests in the northern kingdom were not doing the job anyway, right? They were terrible. So yeah, Michael?
Where is that law?
Which law?
That they all know.
They were practicing so Michael asked which law, where is the law written that these people broke? Yeah, in the Old Testament, in the books of the law, in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, God gives them commands to follow his ways and to drive out all of the pagan practices of the nations that are there. And so that's in Deuteronomy in particular. It says, drive them all out, or else they will become a stumbling block to you. And so here, the nations are coming back in and bringing all of those pagan practices into the land. And so the Lord is sending these lions because it's like, no, these practices, I don't want these practices here at all. All right. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah. So I don't know the exact verse to say like, go here. But it is in Deuteronomy, does talk about this quite a bit. Yeah. No, good question. So they sent this one priest to try to reform everything. So one of the priests who had been exiled from Samaria came to live in Bethel and taught them how to worship the Lord. Nevertheless, each national group made its own gods in several towns where they settled and set them up in the shrines the people of Samaria had made at the high places. The people of Babylon made Sukkot Benoth. From the Kutha made Nergal. From those from Hamath made Ashima. The Avites made Nibhaz and Tartak. And the Sepharvites burned their children in the fire as sacrifices to Adramelech and Anamelech, the gods of Sepharvaim. They worshipped the Lord, but they also appointed all sorts of their own people to officiate for them as priests in the shrines at the high places. They worshiped the Lord, but they also served their own gods in accordance with the customs of the nations from which they had been brought. So even as this one priest is trying to help them worship the Lord, they're still practicing all of this syncretism, mixing of different religious practices. And this is part of what happens in developing the Samaritan people. So when we get to the New Testament and the people of Israel are against the Samaritans, it's because of this kind of intermixing of religious practices that the Samaritans were considered unclean. And so they just try to avoid Samaritans at all costs, which when we read in the Gospel of John, chapter 4, Jesus is coming from Jerusalem and going back north towards Capernaum. And it says he had to go to Samaria. And at the time, a good Jewish man had no reason to go to Samaria. But Jesus had to go through Samaria. And it's ultimately because he came and met the woman at the well and told her about the life that he is the living water. And that through him, she can find freedom and new life and all of these things. And she goes and tells the town, and this whole town starts to listen to Jesus. That's why he had to go to Samaria, because Jesus loves these people, even if the Jewish people at the time avoided them at all costs. Jesus still loved them. And he's trying to bring them into right relationship with God. So, so the Samaritan region is a mix of all kinds of different religions. And verse 34 says, to this day, they persist in the former practices. They neither worship the Lord nor adhere to his decrees and regulations, the laws and commands that the Lord gave the descendants of Jacob, whom he named Israel. When the Lord made a covenant with the Israelites, he commanded them, do not worship any other gods or bow down to them, serve them, or sacrifice to them. But the Lord who brought you up out of Egypt with the mighty power and outstretched arm is the one you must worship. To him you shall bow down, and to him offer sacrifices. You must always be careful to keep the decrees and regulations, the laws and commands he wrote for you. Do not worship other gods. Do not forget the covenant I have made with you, and do not worship other gods. Rather, worship the Lord your God. It is he who will deliver you from the hand of all your enemies. They would not listen, however, but persisted in their former practices. Even while these people were worshiping the Lord, they were serving their idols. To this day, their children and grandchildren continue to do as their ancestors did. So generation after generation persists in holding on to this. We're going to worship the Lord on, for Passover and Feasts of Tabernacles and trumpets and the Day of Atonement. We'll do those things, maybe. But the rest of the year, we're going to do our own thing. It's kind of how this is playing out. It's kind of like and in our own country, we have a lot of folks who say they are Christian, but they really only come to do any kind of Christian things on Christmas or Easter, right? Like, this is not uncommon. But then there's all kinds of things that people worship throughout the rest of the year, like their jobs or their sports team or success and pleasure. Like we all while we don't have these exact idols in our culture, we still have plenty of idols. And so we have to be careful to not look back on this time and say, these people are such a mess. But to recognize like, no, this story is our story also. Like America is a mess. And our, even like when we say we're an American culture or a Christian culture, like there's so much that is not Christian in our culture, but we hold on to that. We gotta watch out and be careful. Did you have a question? I thought I heard something. No? Okay. Okay, cool. I'm just hearing things now. It happens. It's been a long week. So let's jump in. We'll cover one more chapter tonight because we're going to meet a really good king, and we'll end on a decent note. So chapter 18, verse 1, in the third year of Hoshea, king of Elah, king of Israel, Hezekiah, son of Ahaz, king of Judah, began to reign. He was 25 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 29 years. His mother's name was of Abijah, daughter of Zechariah. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, just as his father David had done. He removed the high places, smashed the sacred stones, and cut down the Asherah poles. He broke into pieces the bronze snake Moses had made, for up to that time the Israelites had been burning incense to it. It was called Nehushtan. So Hezekiah comes on the scene, 25 years old, young and full of energy. He's going to make some reforms and be very different than his dad, which is like a big thing. And so he is following David, and he does something that none of the other kings of Judah had done. He removed the high places. And so if we remember, as we've been going through, he followed in the footsteps of David, but the high places remained, right? And we saw that as a continual thing. He was making these allowances for this worship that was not what God wanted, these kings over and over and over again. Hezekiah comes, says no more. And he removes the high places and smashes all of the sacred stones and the Asherah poles. And then the bronze snake that Moses had made, the people had started worshiping it, which was never the intention, because this bronze snake is all the way back in, I believe it is in Numbers when it talks about this, but the people were complaining about something. And so the Lord sent snakes in, and they were fiery snakes is how the Hebrew says it, but they were so venomous and they were biting people. And so people were dying. And so they cried out to the Lord, and the Lord gave Moses instruction, make this bronze snake on a pole and like set it up. And when people look to the snake, they would be healed. And so it is a kind of like, just a reminder, like the Lord is the one who heals you. That was the intention of this bronze snake. And so the people had kept it all this time, and they had started worshiping it, and they named it Nehushtan, which is a combination of the Hebrew words for snake and bronze. It's just it's like a smashing those words together. But they started worshiping it. And so Hezekiah saw this as idolatry, which it is. And so he broke it apart. There's nowhere in the law that said, you got to keep this thing forever. And so he just got rid of it. Sometimes there are things that happen in cultures and churches and organizations that is like, well, that's the way we've always done it. And you just keep doing it that way. And, we have to reevaluate those things. We have to constantly be willing to say, like, what is something that was helpful and important that is not necessary, that we can remove if it's keeping us from continuing to walk in faithfulness to the Lord. And that's what Hezekiah did. So one of the things, I'm going to share a funny story. We were helping a church in Morton, Washington. It's a small church, and their pastor used to go to church here, and he was appointed to go and like minister down there. And so we're going to help with different projects, and we go down there, and he had 2 American flags on the platform, which I love America, okay? But you will note there are no flags of any nation on our platform here at Creekside, partly because it is a distraction to what we're actually here to do, right? That's a personal issue for me. Like I don't want anything other than lifting up Jesus to be happening on Sundays. And so I don't want to have any kind of iconography that would be distracting from that. And so I asked him like, hey, why are there 2 flags? That was my first question. Why are there 2? He's like, I don't know. They've just always been here. I was like, we were going to paint in there. And I was like, do you want them there? And he said, I don't really care. I said, all right, let's try this. I'm going to move them because we're going to paint. And then I'm just not going to put them back. And if anybody asks for them, then you know where they are. But like, if it's a distraction to your church, like I'll be the bad guy here. I'll Hezekiah this. And so I took him out and I saw him a year later. I was like, hey, how's your church going? He's like, great. You know, no one's even asked about those flags. I was like, yeah, I mean, they were just there and they weren't necessary for what you're doing as you're worshiping the Lord. And so moving those kinds of things away from what might distract from what's truly important, in our worship gatherings, like those are important things to think about. And so like changing, like for years, we had a model at our church at the ship's wheel. McCall, you were here for that. And it was like, as we were talking about how we do our ministry, and, I was very hesitant to change that because I helped formulate it and it was helpful for a long time. But we had to reevaluate something like that and move away from the ship's wheel. And so now it's a table. And partly because everybody has a table, not everybody has a boat. So we all use tables all the time. But those kinds of things, like you can lift up even a model of ministry and say, this is what we have to do all the time this way. But that just becomes a bronze snake. And you have to reevaluate those things. Michael, you raise your hand.
I fly my flag. Like this story happened in my country.
Right.
1906. Patriotic exercises for denationalization of the Hawaii Kingdom was in the newspaper back then.
Right.
Orders for
Yeah. And so like having a sense of pride for your people is not a bad thing, right? But when your pride for your people becomes the ultimate thing, like that's when we should evaluate. Right. Yeah. Yeah. So read through Deuteronomy and you can see like when they were talking about driving the people out, it was ultimately because of their idolatry that was going to be a stumbling block to the people. And then even here in 17, for reiteration, like do this because it's going to be a stumbling block to you, the people of Israel. So what happened here, though, we have to be careful to not like take this. And this is where Christians in the last 200 years have done great damage in the world, because we took this and tied it up with empires. And we said, let's go be Christian empires in places. And that has hurt so many people in the world, because the empire was the missionary force when it should be disciples of Jesus going and being the missionary force without the need for empire, but to share the hope of Jesus with people beyond boundaries, beyond borders. So Hezekiah is bringing reform. All right. And so it's with that bronze snake, verse 5. Sorry, I had some folks drop out and they're coming back in now. Hezekiah trusted the Lord, the God of Israel. There was no one like him among all the kings of Judah, either before him or after him. He held fast to the Lord and did not stop following him. He kept the commands of the Lord had given Moses, and the Lord was with him. He was successful in whatever he undertook. He rebelled against the king of Assyria and did not serve him. From watchtower to fortified city, he defeated the Philistines as far as Gaza and its territory. In King Hezekiah's 4th year, which was the 7th year of Hoshea, king of Elah, king of Israel, Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, marched against Samaria and laid siege to it. At the end of 3 years, the Assyrians took it. So Samaria was captured in Hezekiah's 6th year, which was the 9th year of Hoshea, king of Israel. The king of Assyria deported Israel to Assyria and settled them in Hala and Gozan in the Habor River and in the towns of Medes. And this happened because they had not obeyed the Lord their God, but had violated his covenant, all that Moses and the servant of the Lord commanded. They neither listened to the commandments nor carried them out. In the 14th year of King Hezekiah's reign, Sennacherib, so a new king in Assyria, comes to power. Sennacherib, king of Assyria, attacked all the fortified cities of Judah and captured them. So Hezekiah, king of Judah, sent this message to the king of Assyria at Lachish: I have done wrong. Withdraw from me, and I will pay whatever you demand of me. The king of Assyria exacted from Hezekiah, king of Judah, 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold. So Hezekiah gave him all the silver that was found in the temple of the Lord and in the treasuries of the royal palace. At this time, Hezekiah, king of Judah, stripped off the gold, which he had covered the doors and doorposts of the temple of the Lord, and gave it to the king of Assyria. So Hezekiah, really good king, seeing success after success after success. But here, when Assyria comes, he pays off the Assyrians again. Not to the point where he's like, I want to be a vassal to you, but like, please just go away, is kind of the money transaction here. But now Assyria is the power player, and they are going to continue to be a threat in the region. And so Isaiah, the ministry of Isaiah, is happening during several kings of Judah, but he will talk about Hezekiah. He will talk to Hezekiah directly as well. And we'll get a little bit of that next week. We'll meet more from Isaiah. But yeah, so even though Hezekiah is doing good in so many different ways, Assyria is still a problem. And so even stripping off the gold on the door frames to pay off the king, like, this is not a good place. So then verse 17, the king of Assyria sent his supreme commander, his chief officer, and his field commander with a large army from Lachish to King Hezekiah at Jerusalem. They came up to Jerusalem and stopped at the aqueduct of the upper pool on the road to the washerman's field. They called for the king, and Eliakim, son of Hilkiah, the palace administrator, Shebna, the secretary, and Joah, son of Asaph, the recorder, went out to them. The field commander said to them, tell Hezekiah. So this is basically, the Assyrians are coming and they're going to attack, is what we should be feeling, this impending doom. This is what the great king, the king of Assyria, says. Oh, on what are you basing this confidence of yours? You say you have counsel and the might for war, but you speak only empty words. On whom are you depending that you rebel against me? Look, I know you are depending on Egypt, that splintered reed of a staff, which pierced the hand of anyone who leans on it. Such is Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to all who depend on him. But if you say to me, we are depending on the Lord our God, isn't he the one whose high places and altars Hezekiah removed, saying to Judah and Jerusalem, you must worship before this altar in Jerusalem? Come now, make a bargain with my master, the king of Assyria. I will give you 2,000 horses. If you can put riders on them, how can you repulse one officer of the least of my master's officials, even though you are depending on Egypt for chariots and horsemen? Furthermore, have I come to attack and destroy this place without word from the Lord? The Lord himself told me to march against this country and destroy it. So this message from the king of Assyria is trying to throw some doubts into the people, because he's talking to a place where, like, on the aqueduct coming into Jerusalem, there would be people around who could hear, like people on the walls who could hear this man's message. And so he highlights a few things. It's like, who are you depending on? And knowing that previous kings in the region had turned to Egypt, and that didn't work out, he's saying, like, Egypt's not going to help you. They're weak. They can't do this for you. And then he says, are you trusting on the Lord? Because didn't Hezekiah just go through and remove all the places of worship? And so when he's talking, the king of Assyria knows about these high places and all this stuff, and he must be assuming that these are the Lord's high places. And so he's like, people of Judah, like, Hezekiah doesn't want you to worship God. He's taking away all the places to worship. And he's saying you have to come into Jerusalem to worship? That doesn't sound like God. And then once further, he says, the Lord himself told me to come and attack you. And so he's throwing all of this doubt into this confrontation. So then Eliakim, son of Hilkiah, and Shebna and Joah said to the field commander, please speak to your servants in Aramaic, since we understand it. Don't speak to us in Hebrew in the hearing of the people on the wall. So he's like, let's change the language here and speak something that all these people don't know. But the commander replied, was it only to your master and you that my master sent me to say these things, and not to the people sitting on the wall who, like you, will have to eat their own excrement and drink their own urine? So, yeah, I mean, that's the siege mentality. Like, you're only going to be able to eat and drink your waste if you let us siege Jerusalem. Then the commander stood and called out in Hebrew, hear the word of the great king, the king of Assyria. This is what the king says. Do not let Hezekiah deceive you. He cannot deliver you from my hand. Do not let Hezekiah persuade you to trust in the Lord. When he says the Lord will surely deliver us, the city will not be given into the hand of the king of Assyria. Do not listen to Hezekiah. This is what the king of Assyria says. Make peace with me and come out to me. Then each of you will eat fruit from your own vine and fig tree and drink water from your own cistern until I come and take you to a land like your own, a land of grain and new wine, a land of bread and vineyards, a land of olive trees and honey. Choose life and not death. Does that sound familiar? Those are the promises that God made to the people of Israel. I'm taking you to a land flowing with milk and honey, a land where you will have life and abundance, and it'll be great. The Lord made all of these promises to the people if they walk in faithfulness. And here, the message from the king of Assyria is, come out to me, you'll be safe, you'll be good, and then I will take you to a different land. And he's still saying, like, you're not going to stay here forever. I'll take you someplace else. And so he's trying to put himself in the place of the Lord to fulfill these kinds of promises. So do not listen to Hezekiah for he is misleading you when he says the Lord will deliver us. Has the God of any nation ever delivered his land from the hand of the king of Assyria? Where are the gods of Hamath and Arpad? Where are the gods of Sepharvaim, Hena, and Iva? Have they rescued Samaria from my hand? Who of all the gods of these countries has been able to save his land from me? How then can the Lord deliver Jerusalem from my hand? But the people remained silent and said nothing in reply, because the king had commanded, do not answer him. Then Eliakim, son of Hilkiah, the palace administrator, Shebna, the secretary, and Joah, son of Asaph, the recorder, went to Hezekiah with their clothes torn and told him what the field commander had said. So, not a great situation. Like, you're going to lose because everybody loses, is basically the message of the Assyrians. The Assyrian Empire has all the power, all the earthly power in this situation. And the people are forgetting, though, like he said, has any nation ever withstood my hand? And they need to remember that just a few decades earlier, the Assyrians were trying to come and attack again, and the Lord did deliver the northern kingdom. Like, he can do this. He can fight their battles, but it's overwhelming when you see the army of the nation coming at you, and you're walled up in this little city, and you don't have a lot of options. And so that's where we're going to stop tonight. Because the Lord, I'll just so you get through the week and not worry too much. The Lord does deliver Jerusalem from the Assyrians. I mean, it says right here, the next heading, Jerusalem's deliverance foretold. All right. He will deliver them from the Assyrians, but the Assyrians are not the big problem here. Even for the nation of Judah, the Assyrians are not the problem. The Babylonians are not the problem. The people of Jerusalem are the problem. The people of Judah and their own disobedience is what's going to take them out of the land, not just because these powerful armies are coming against them. It is their disobedience that leads to this destruction. So, so Assyria, like all the empires of the world, is long gone. Every empire falls eventually. And so, yeah, that's where we'll stop. Any questions? Yeah, Michael.
Is this Uriah related to the Bathsheba's husband?
No. Yeah, Uriah is a common name, so it's a different person. So yeah. Yeah, that was actually like several hundred years before these events. So no. Good question though. Michael was asking, is this Uriah connected to David and Bathsheba incident? So no, that Uriah was murdered by conspiracy with David and what's that?
Was it Joab?
Joab, yes. I was gonna say Jonah. I was like, that's not Jonah. Yeah, Joab. So yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
Talks about the high places, and then it added under every spreading tree. That's the first time I really remember seeing that. Is that a different way that they're worshiping, or is it
Yeah.
a different God?
So Pat's asking about under the high places in every spreading tree, and the spreading tree imagery, like the Asherah poles, like we're not really sure what those were. And so one of the theories is that they would go to a copse of trees and they would carve one into a pole of some sort that they would worship. And so that might just be a reference to the places where Asherah was worshipped. So yeah, good question.
Jason,
Assyria is in modern day Iran. So the Persian people would be the descendants of the Assyrians. Yeah. So Persia and Babylon, like the Babylonians were coming from Iraq, and so the Persians are from Iran, and then but then Syria is Aram, and so these nation group states have different names, but the people are the descendants, like they're still ethnically connected to those different people groups. So I heard a question over here. Sandy, hi.
the gods, how were they created and how far? I assume they go way, way back, but I know the reptiles and all that sort of thing, but I mean, going way back. And why did the people follow those gods? Was it because the kings told them they had to and they just were obedient, or what?
Yeah.
Kind of curious.
Oh, Sandy, that's such a great question. So if you didn't hear, she's asking like, where did these gods come from and why did they worship them?
So why did they still worship them? I know, like I lived in Japan and Buddha was right nearby.
Yeah. So there are a lot of different ways that we could answer this question, Sandy. And one of the most, I think, helpful ways to approach these different gods is recognizing that there is a supernatural world. And so while Yahweh is the Lord and he is like the God over all of creation and all of the supernatural, there are also, messengers of God that we call angels. And in scripture, we learn about the angels and demons, which are fallen angels. And so what it makes most sense is that even these gods that people are worshiping are somehow connected to these fallen angels. And so there is a demonic force at work in these different gods. Mm-hmm. And so the great battle here for the Lord with the people of Israel is he wants their ultimate allegiance to trust him only. But there's all of these different idols and supernatural beings that are pulling at their hearts, promising them things that in all of the idolatry, not just the people of Israel, but all these other nations as well, promising them like, hey, if you put your kids through the fire, I will make sure that you have a good harvest. And so there's this.
That?
What's that?
Do people really believe that?
It seems that way. Yes. And so Yeah, so all of these different idols in the land are like supernatural realities. Like there's a supernatural reality here, but they all are leading to destruction.
Okay.
They are deceiving and lying to people because they're evil. And that's part of why the Lord wants to drive them out of Canaan, and so Israel could live there and flourish there. But if as long as these idols are, and these gods, lowercase g gods, are trying to like infiltrate, they're always going to pull at people's hearts.
Right.
And so that's still happening today. And so while we don't worship Mammon, right, that is a god of the ancient world that was associated with money and wealth. So while we don't have a statue to Mammon, we got all these massive skyscrapers with bank names on them, right? And so like that's still a big deal. You know, I was talking in the class that I teach at Northwest, we were talking about worldview this last week and talking about symbols and icons for worldview. And like we have in on Wall Street in New York, there's a bronze statue of a bull.
Yeah.
Like that's in America, where we have this bronze statue of this bull, and people go there every day and they do work in honor of that bull. And they don't call it worship, but they call it pursuing wealth. And that's getting on dangerous territory here. If that's the only thing that really matters in your life is pursuing this wealth, you will kill yourself for that bull. And yeah, and there's a path we can go down as we think about all that bull means in our culture even now, and a word that follows it sometimes. I won't use that word here in polite company. Yeah, but these idols, like all of these idols are pulling at people's hearts, and idols always deceive, always. And we hear a promise and we think, well, the Lord's not doing that for me. I will trust in these other things. And that's still happening all the time. So yeah, there's a book. There is a book by an author that may help bring some clarity if you're interested. It's called The Unseen Realm by Michael Heiser. He talks a lot about like this supernatural worldview. And I don't agree with everything Heiser says, but it does help make sense about what's happening in ancient Israel with all of the temptation to these different idols. Like it's very interesting. So The Unseen Realm by Michael Heiser. He's an academic, so it gets kind of dry. Just FYI. Janet.
This kind of probably goes along with that question. Golden calves keep popping up here and there in the Bible. Is that a particular god that represents?
Great question. So Jen is asking about golden calves in the Bible. And so what does that God represent? What does that represent? And so the golden calf, the first instance of the golden calf is in Exodus when Moses is up on Sinai and the people are like, Aaron, make us gods for us. And so he tries to make a representation of Yahweh, which the Lord said, don't ever do, right? So that's that. And so when the golden calves, when Jeroboam makes the two golden calves in Dan and Bethel, he is trying to give people a representation of Yahweh as well, which the Lord said, never do. One of the challenges for us, even with Solomon, is he has put these bronze bulls in the temple under this basin, this wash basin. So even as Jeroboam is leaving between the northern and southern kingdoms, that revolution that's happening there, Jeroboam probably went to the temple and saw that basin, and he probably thought, oh, well, let's just have some of those up here. And so it's not all Jeroboam's fault. Solomon probably should not have done that, like put the bulls in the temple. But it was a sign of power, right? And so yeah, so we start bringing iconography like that into our worship systems. It's a I hate to use the phrase slippery slope because it's overused, but that is a slippery slope. You start saying like, this is how I worship with this imagery, and it's really easy to turn that image into the idol. Yeah, so the bronze bull is like an attempt to represent God,
And the
but
battle-
God said, don't do that. Don't do that. So, Michael, do you have another question?
The snake
Yeah.
is the only animal that was cursed by God. in this book that we-
Yeah. Yeah. So the snake was the only animal cursed by God. The serpent in Genesis chapter 3, specifically. Yeah.
Is any other creature cursed by God himself?
I don't think there's a specific animal that is cursed by the Lord. But I mean, there are unclean animals, and serpents were unclean. So you were never supposed to eat a snake. So that there's a whole like, yeah. So the snake on a stick is it should be a reminder to us about like the curse. Yeah, like it is like a really gross corn dog. But like the snake on the stick, like it should be a reminder of the curse of sinfulness, right? And so you look to that reminder to say, oh, this snake is here because of sin, and not because this snake on the pole will heal me. No, it's the Lord who can reverse the curse. And so, yeah, so good observation, Michael. Yeah. Did you have any other thoughts on that? No. All right. Yeah. When we start getting into like this section in particular, like we haven't heard about this snake on a stick for hundreds of years, right? And then all of a sudden, Hezekiah's like, we got to break this thing apart. Like, how long had it been going on? Where they're like, well, I'm just going to burn some incense to this bronze pole real quick. It's like, why are you doing that? Like, where did this come from? Yeah, but John Calvin, one of the leaders of the Reformation, he says the human heart is an idol factory.
Sure.
And we are so good at making idols. So yeah, Nicole.
Is it, to me, it seems like it's tied to like where traditions of common, today's churches the tradition can be more important than the reason the tradition was started.
Right. Yeah.
We lose sight of what we're supposed to be thinking about and just focus on the tradition.
Yeah.
As what's in.
Right. Yeah. So what McCall is saying, if you didn't hear, was this idolatry can be built up around the traditions, where we focus on the tradition instead of the reason behind the tradition. So even like, I mean, I love our Christmas Eve services. I love them. They're wonderful. But if we think the only thing of significance at Christmas Eve is the candle lighting, which is, there are people who like, that's why I go. Like, oh, what? No, this should not be why you go. This should be a part of just, a celebration. But this is not the reason you go to a Christmas Eve service. Communion can become an idol for people, where we start to think this bread and juice, they are my salvation.
Mm.
But they're not. They are a symbol of our salvation to remind us of what Jesus has done for us. And so, in our tradition in the Assemblies of God, we have tried very hard to not get overly traditional. We're a fairly young denomination. We're just over 100 years old. And so like there's time now though, where things are starting to get into a place where it's like, oh, remember the good old days? remember this. And like, if we're not careful, those good old days can become our idols. And so we just have to be very careful and constantly like bring all the sacred cows to the altar and slaughter them and continue moving in faithfulness to the Lord. So, yeah, it's wonderful imagery. So, yeah. Any other questions? These are great questions, by the way. I love talking about this stuff. Carrie, do I see a hand there?
Sure. And was the bull was that a symbology of Moloch?
No, the bull was an attempt to image the Lord.
Okay, so
Yahweh.
that was their way of thinking that that's what God looked like?
Kind of, yeah. There is no, I mean, we don't know what God looks like. And so they can't, no one says the Lord is a bull, but that's what they tried to do, was say all the way back in Exodus, Aaron, give us a God.
Yeah.
And Aaron said, this is your God that brought you out of Egypt. And so that was not, it was not enough, because no image can capture all of God.
No.
And so, yeah. All
The
right.
other thing too was, it seems like when was it Hezekiah is trying to do right, just the timing of it. The people were doing wrong, and God had had enough and allowed them to be threatened by Sennacherib. And it just seems ironic, when one person's really trying to do right, that's when you get attacked.
Yeah. That's the nature of spiritual warfare.
Yeah.
So it seems like when people in my own life, when I try to take a step of faith, is when I feel the most spiritual opposition, right? And so here Hezekiah is bringing all these great reforms to the people, but it's kind of a too little too late situation. And so there will be, several generations of kings after Hezekiah, but they will not. Judah's fate is kind of already sealed, as in chapter 18 or 17, we're starting to get those indications. Even Judah was doing these things that the northern kingdom was doing. And so we're being told as we're reading along, like, and Judah's not long for this world either. So
They were
Yeah.
being put in time out.
it's about 70 years, so it's a long one.
Yeah.
So it's not a short timeout. But and we'll get to that when we get to Jeremiah, but the timeout or exile is also because they were not following the laws about the Sabbath rest for the land. And so the Lord is like, I'm going to give the land 70 years of Sabbath rest because you have not been giving the years of the Sabbath rest where they let the land lie fallow and just rest from agriculture. And so none of it is on accident, what the Lord is doing. None of this is on accident. He's like, I said the land needs this rest. I'm going to make sure it happens. And we'll get to that. It's going to be great. It'll be so fun. So in like 2025, we'll get there.
Couple years down the road. It's all good.
Eventually. So, all right. Any other thoughts, questions? No? All right, y'all, let's wrap here and then we'll come back. We'll do 19 through 21 is what we'll target for next week. And then we'll keep on keeping on. So y'all have a good night.